still remember the weight of silence in those mountains before the snow began to fall. It was February 1910, and I worked as a mail clerk on the Great Northern Railway line that cut through the Cascade Range in Washington state. The route passed through a place called Wellington, nothing more than a depot and a few maintenance shacks clinging to the mountainside at nearly 3,000 feet. We arrived on February 23rd with 2 trains, passenger and mail, expecting to cross Stevens Pass by evening. The snow started that night, not the usual mountain snow that falls and settles. This came down in walls, thick and wet, building faster than the rotary plows could move it. By the second day, we were trapped. The depot sat on a narrow shelf carved into the slope. Above us rose a steep face of rock and timber. Below dropped a ravine so deep that you could not see the bottom through the weather. Our train cars sat on the siding parallel to the mountain, close enough to the depot that passengers could move between them and the building without getting buried. 9 days we stayed there. The snow piled higher each morning. Drifts reached the windows. The telegraph lines went down on day 4. The rotary plow broke through its gears on day 6, trying to cut a path. We burned coal to keep the cars warm and rationed food that was meant to last 2 days, not over a week. What troubled me most was the sound. Snow that deep changes how noise travels. Voices came muffled and strange, but sometimes I heard other sounds, low groans from the slope above us, like the mountain was shifting its weight. The old railroad men said it was just settling snow, but their eyes stayed on that slope longer than they needed to, and none of them slept near the windows anymore. On the night of February 28th, I was awake in the mail car sorting letters by lamplight. Sleep had become difficult. The air inside felt too close, and every creak of the car's frame made my chest tighten. Outside, the wind had finally stopped. For the first time in 9 days, the world went still. I remember checking my pocket watch. It read 1:42 a.m. I set it on the sorting table and reached for another bundle of mail. That's when I felt the train car shift beneath my feet just slightly, like the earth had exhaled. Then came the sound. Not wind, not thunder. A deep fracture running through solid matter. The kind of sound you feel in your bones before your ears understand it. The mountain let go. I don't remember the initial impact. My next clear memory is hanging sideways in darkness with mail scattered around me like snow. The lamp had gone out. My ribs screamed when I tried to breathe. I could hear metal grinding against rock and the muffled screams of passengers somewhere in the wreckage below. I forced myself through a gap where the car's wall had torn away. Cold bit into my hands. I crawled over splintered wood and twisted steel, following the screams. Dawn came slowly, gray and flat. When there was enough light to see, I understood what had happened. Both trains had been swept off the tracks and thrown into the ravine. The passenger cars lay broken open like crates dropped from height. Bodies hung from the wreckage, some still in their night clothes. The snow around them was dark. Survivors gathered in small groups, maybe 20 of us able to walk. A woman clutched a child who would not stop shaking. A porter bled from a gash across his forehead but kept moving, pulling others from the debris. We worked in silence, listening for voices under the snow. That's when I saw them. 3 figures standing on the canyon wall to the east, perhaps 200 yards distant. They stood upright on a slope too steep for footing. No rescue team had arrived yet. The railroad depot above had been destroyed in the slide. These figures wore no recognizable clothing, and they did not move like men struggling through deep snow. I pointed them out to the porter beside me. He stopped his work and stared. The woman with the child looked up and went very still. We watched those figures for perhaps a minute. They remained motionless, observing us from their impossible perch. Then they turned in unison and walked directly into the rock face. Not around it, not over it, into it. The porter whispered that we should not tell the others yet. We had enough to fear already. The rescue teams arrived on the second day after the slide. They came on snowshoes from Scenic, the next depot down the line, carrying shovels and medical supplies and long poles for probing the snow. A civil engineer named Harrison led the effort. He was a thin man with wire spectacles that fogged constantly in the cold. He organized us into lines and showed us how to work methodically through the debris field. We found 17 more bodies that day. Each one we pulled from the snow felt heavier than the last. On the third day, Harrison's crew began cutting through a massive drift that had piled against the eastern canyon wall. They were searching for a section of passenger car that had been torn away in the slide. The snow there had compressed into something closer to ice, and the work went slowly. I was 20 feet away when I heard Harrison shout for his men to stop digging. His voice carried a strange note, not alarm exactly, more like confusion. I walked over and found him kneeling at the edge of the cut they had made. He held his lamp close to the snow wall. There was a hole, not a gap in the snow, a deliberate opening that led back into darkness. The edges were too smooth, too regular. Harrison reached his hand inside and said the walls felt carved. He pulled his hand back quickly and wiped it on his coat. The air coming from that opening moved against my face. It was warmer than it should have been and carried a smell I could not place. Mineral, but also organic, like wet stone mixed with something living. Harrison ordered 2 men to widen the entrance. They worked carefully, breaking away the compressed snow to reveal more of the passage. Within an hour, the opening was large enough for a man to enter. The walls inside were not snow at all. They were stone, dark gray and smooth, with shallow grooves running along the surface in parallel lines. Harrison lit a second lamp and stepped inside. I followed him without being asked. The passage sloped downward at a gentle angle. Our lamps showed the tunnel extending beyond the reach of light. The floor was level and free of debris. No snow had drifted in. The air current continued to flow past us, steady and warm. We walked perhaps 50 yards before Harrison stopped. He raised his lamp toward the ceiling. There, carved into the stone, were marks that formed a pattern, not random scratches, deliberate shapes repeating at regular intervals. Harrison touched one with his fingertips and said this tunnel was not natural. He said it was also not new. He asked me if I had ever heard of anything like this in these mountains. I told him no, but I did not tell him about the figures I had seen walking into the rock face 2 days before. We returned to the surface, and Harrison reported the tunnel to the rescue coordinator, a railroad supervisor named Echt who had arrived from Seattle. Echt listened without expression and told Harrison to seal the opening and continue searching for survivors. Harrison argued that the tunnel should be documented and explored properly. Echt said the railroad company would handle it after the rescue operation concluded. That night, those of us who had survived the slide sheltered in canvas tents erected on stable ground above the debris field. The temperature dropped below freezing and the wind returned. I lay in my bedroll between 2 other men, listening to the canvas snap and strain. Around midnight, I heard singing. It came from beneath us, muffled but clear enough to follow the melody. Not words I recognized, not a tune from any hymnal or folk song I knew. The notes rose and fell in patterns that felt deliberate, almost rhythmic, like a work song sung by many voices in unison. I sat up and saw that others were awake too. A brakeman named Peterson stared at the tent floor with his blanket pulled to his chin. The woman who had held the shaking child sat rigid and still. No one spoke. The singing continued for perhaps 10 minutes, then stopped abruptly. The silence that followed felt heavier than the sound. In the morning, I approached one of the Snoqualmie guides who had come with the rescue teams. His name was William, though the other guides called him something else in their language. I asked if he had heard the singing. He looked at me for a long moment before answering. He said his people knew about the voices in these mountains. He said there were places where the snow grew deep that should not be walked after dark. He said the slide had opened something that was meant to stay closed. I asked what he meant by that. He shook his head and said it was not his place to explain what white men would not believe. Later that day, I saw William and the two other Snoqualmie guides standing at the edge of the debris field. They were looking at a section of wreckage near the eastern wall, the same area where Harrison had found the tunnel entrance. William pointed at something in the snow, spoke quietly to the others, and then all three of them walked away from that section and did not return to it. I went to see what they had been looking at. In the snow, arranged in a perfect circle perhaps 6 feet across, were stones. Each stone was smooth and dark, placed with care at even intervals. In the center of the circle lay a bundle of dried sage tied with what looked like sinew. No one from our camp had placed it there. The official count from the Great Northern Railway listed 96 dead from the Wellington slide. That number was repeated in every newspaper from Seattle to Chicago. The railroad supervisors verified it. The county coroner signed documents confirming it. But 3 survivors insisted the count was wrong. One was a Pullman conductor named Albert Mahler who had worked the passenger train for 11 years. He kept a manifest in his coat pocket that he had grabbed from his sleeper car before the slide hit. On the morning after the avalanche, Mahler walked through the survivors with his pencil and marked off names. When he finished, he told me privately that 7 people were missing from his count. The second was a schoolteacher from Spokane named Mrs. Sarah Whitcomb. She had been traveling with her sister and remembered speaking with a young couple in the dining car the evening before the slide. She described them in detail, their clothing, their conversation about homesteading near Wenatchee. When she asked the railroad officials about them, she was told no such passengers had been on the train. The third was a freight handler named Ruiz who helped pull survivors from the wreckage in those first hours. He swore he dragged 4 men from a crushed mail car and saw them walk toward the tents under their own power. 2 days later, those men did not appear on any survivor list. Ruiz asked after them repeatedly until a supervisor told him to stop making trouble. I did not speak up at the time, but I had noticed things too. Footprints in the snow leading away from camp that did not belong to any rescue worker. They led east toward the canyon wall and simply ended at the base of sheer rock, as though whoever made them had walked straight into stone. There were drag marks as well, long shallow grooves in the snow that started near the debris field and moved in the same direction. The marks were too narrow for a stretcher and too deliberate for something pulled by accident. They followed a path that curved around obstacles with clear intention. On the 5th day, a railroad investigator arrived from Spokane to document the disaster. I showed him the drag marks and the footprints. He took notes and told me the snow played tricks on the eyes. He said traumatized people often saw patterns that were not there. That same afternoon, Mahler was told by railroad officials that his manifest had been damaged in the slide and could not be trusted. Mrs. Whitcomb was informed that her memory was faulty due to shock. Ruiz was sent back to Seattle on the first available train and told his services were no longer needed. The official count remained 96 dead. No one from the railroad company would discuss it further. On the 6th day after the slide, a section foreman named Duluth found the first arrangement. He had been checking the perimeter of the camp at dawn, looking for tools that had been scattered during the rescue effort. He came back to the cook tent and asked if anyone had been building cairns in the night. No one had. He led a small group of us to what he had found. 50 yards from the nearest tent, set on flat ground that we crossed every day, was a circle of stones identical to the one the Snoqualmie guides had discovered. But this one was larger, perhaps 8 feet across, and in its center were not sage bundles but something else entirely. Wildflowers, frozen solid but clearly fresh when they had been placed. Lupine and avalanche lilies arranged in a spiral pattern with their stems all pointing inward. No flowers grew anywhere near Wellington in February. The slopes were buried under 15 feet of snow. Duluth crouched beside the circle and reached toward the flowers. I told him not to touch them. Something in my voice made him pull his hand back. That same morning, a railroad conductor named Vogel reported that his boots had been moved during the night. He had left them outside his tent, caked in mud and blood from working the debris field. When he woke, the boots sat in a different position, cleaned thoroughly, the leather oiled. Beside them lay a small carved figure made of pale wood, no longer than my thumb, shaped like a human but with proportions that were not quite right. Vogel held the figure up for us to see. The detail was extraordinary. Tiny fingers, individual strands suggested in the hair, a face with features too fine for rough carving. He asked who in camp had the skill to make such a thing. No one answered. By evening, 2 more people reported finding objects near their tents. A nurse discovered a bundle of cedar bark tied with gut string. A telegraph operator found 3 smooth river stones stacked in perfect balance on a piece of driftwood that had not been there the night before. None of these items were threatening. They seemed placed with care, almost reverently. But the fact that someone or something had moved through our camp while we slept, passing within feet of us without sound or detection, made sleep impossible that night. I lay awake listening to every small noise, the wind, the settling snow, the creak of tent poles. And once, perhaps an hour before dawn, I heard footsteps outside. Soft and deliberate, moving between the tents with purpose. I did not look outside, neither did anyone else. In the morning, we found more stones arranged in circles and more gifts we had not asked for. The railroad company ordered a full evacuation on March 8th, 9 days after the slide. They said the slope remained unstable and another avalanche could come at any time. A relief train waited at Scenic to carry survivors down to lower elevation. Most people packed quickly, grateful to leave. Harrison, the engineer, requested permission to stay behind with a small crew to document the tunnels. He wanted to map the passages and understand their extent before the railroad sealed them permanently. Eck denied the request twice, but Harrison persisted. Finally, Eck agreed to let him remain for 72 hours with 2 volunteers. A young surveyor named McKee volunteered first. He was fresh from a technical college in Portland and saw the tunnels as a geological curiosity worth studying. The second volunteer was Ruiz, the freight handler who had been sent away and then quietly returned on his own fare. He said he needed to know what happened to the men he had pulled from the wreckage. I considered volunteering myself but did not. Something about the way Harrison spoke of the tunnels felt wrong to me, like he was treating them as a professional opportunity rather than a place that deserved caution. The rest of us boarded the relief train that afternoon. As we pulled away from Wellington, I looked back at the 3 men standing beside their tent near the eastern canyon wall. They looked very small against the slope. Their lamp was already lit even though sunset was hours away. That final night, those of us on the relief train were housed in a temporary shelter at Scenic. We slept on cots in a converted warehouse with a coal stove that barely kept the cold out. Around 10 o'clock, the wind picked up outside and rattled the walls. Just after midnight, I woke to tapping. It came from beneath the floorboards, the same 2-tap rhythm I had heard in the mountains, slow and deliberate. I sat up and saw that others were awake too, sitting rigid in their cots, staring at the floor. The tapping moved across the room, passing under each row of cots in sequence. When it reached the far wall, it stopped. Then came a new sound, a soft scraping against wood like fingernails testing the boards from below. Vogel, the conductor, stood and walked to the door. He did not run. He moved with strange calm, almost like he was sleepwalking. He opened the door and stepped outside into the dark. 3 others followed him, including Mrs. Whitcomb and the nurse who had found the cedar bark bundle. I started to rise to call them back, but Mahler grabbed my arm and shook his head. His eyes were wide and his grip was tight enough to hurt. Outside, I heard footsteps in the gravel, then voices, low and rhythmic, singing that same melody we had heard beneath the tents. The sound faded gradually into the distance, moving up the mountain back toward Wellington. When morning came, the 4 who had walked outside were asleep in their cots as though they had never left. None of them remembered going out. None of them remembered the singing, but each one had dirt under their fingernails that had not been there before. Harrison, McKee, and Ruiz were scheduled to return from Wellington on March 11th. The railroad sent a crew up the line that morning to retrieve them. The crew found the camp intact, the tents still standing, supplies neatly arranged. The tunnel entrance had been widened further with timber bracing installed to keep it open. But the 3 men were gone. Their lamps sat cold on a rock near the tunnel mouth. Their bedrolls lay undisturbed inside the tent. Harrison's surveying equipment remained set up on its tripod, his notebook open to a page of measurements and sketches. The final entry was dated March 10th at 4:17 p.m. It read, "Passage extends minimum 400 yards. Multiple branches, evidence of habitation proceeding to lower junction." Below that, in different handwriting, possibly McKee's, someone had written, "They're not hostile, they're showing us." Nothing else. No sign of struggle, no blood, no indication of what happened after that entry was made. The Army Corps of Engineers was brought in that summer to assess the tunnel system. They worked for 6 weeks mapping what they could access. Their report was classified and sealed for 30 years. When it was finally released in 1940, most of the technical details had been redacted. The only substantive paragraph remaining stated that the tunnel system was of unknown origin, extensive, and intentionally excavated by means that do not correspond to any documented mining or construction technique. The report recommended permanent closure and monitoring. It noted that several survey team members reported auditory phenomena and psychological distress while working underground. 2 engineers requested reassignment before the survey was complete. In 1911, the railroad renamed Wellington to Thai, claiming the old name carried bad associations. By 1929, the depot was abandoned entirely when a new tunnel route was opened. The site was left to collapse under its own weight. But hikers still walk those mountains, and some of them report hearing things when the snow gets deep. Singing that does not match any human voice. Tapping sounds that move beneath their feet. They find stone circles in clearings where no one has camped. They see figures on slopes too steep for climbing. Most people dismiss these stories. They say the mountain plays tricks. They say wind through ice makes strange sounds. They say grief and fear create patterns in randomness. I never went back to the Cascades. I left railroad work entirely and found employment in Sacramento, where the ground stays flat and nothing lives beneath that should not be there. But I still dream about those 9 days, the singing under the tents, the figures walking into stone, the gifts left beside our boots, and I think about Harrison's final words in that notebook. They're showing us. Showing us what, he never said, and now we'll never know.